Before dawn, the sea held its breath around Dragonstone. The waves that had battered rock and memory into the island's black bones lay mute and heavy beneath a skin of mist. Ash-colored gulls wheeled without calling. Smoke from the kitchens ghosted along the low ground, thin as an old woman's hair, and the smell of coal and fish oil crawled through the passages to the highest tower where the Red Woman kept her night. Melisandre had not slept. She seldom did when the air tasted like iron and old storms. A brazier the size of a cradle glowed in the center of her chamber, its coals banked and fed with resinous chips from ships that had died in foreign seas. She watched the flames as one might listen. She leaned close enough that heat rasped her throat when she breathed, and her hair, loosed from its iron thorns, fell forward copper at the ends where it drank the light. The flames were reluctant tonight, thick with a smoky blue that curled and shut like a stubborn eyelid. She fed them a sliver of weirwood shavings bound with twine, a theft she would not confess to any god. The tongues hissed and rose, and the smoke peeled back like a curtain when a noble enters a hall. She saw a child, not as she had seen children in the flames before, distant, shimmering with the cowardice of heat. This one came forward with the heedless certainty of an arrow, a small palm pressed to a window, fogging it with breath. Behind the glass, the sea heaved and whitened. On the child's cheek a patch of gray, as if frost had kissed and refused to leave. The window's frost ring made a crown about the hand, and in the crown's reflection she glimpsed antlers of fire. Light swarmed the hand, and at the edges of the vision smoke unrolled like banners. Salt on the tongue, salt in the eyes, salt in the wound. The child turned her head, and what had been gray became stone like the sea-lapped steps of old Valeria's drowned gates. Stone and yet warm, for the color of life flushed the other cheek. A breath, and behind her, the world darkened into clotted black, the shape of a wall of night. From within it came a thin, sweet note like a pipe, and another like the creak of ice shifting under weight. In the blackness, stars winked and went out, and in the last blaze before the vision closed, she saw, no, felt, words with no tongue to speak them. "No prince," said the heat. "No man," said the smoke, and laughed almost. A woman's laugh that had learned pity too late. Child of salt and stone, awaken not the sword, awaken the song. Melisandre drew back. The chamber's cold folded around her like a disapproving ant. Down in the yard the armorer was already awake. She heard his hammer ring twice, pause and ring again. Between each blow she listened vainly for the old gull's complaint. When she could taste nothing but ash again, and the coals had settled into their dull bruise of orange. She lifted the ruby at her throat, as if it were a lamp, and passed into the corridor. The castle never stopped whispering. Dragonstone's walls sweated in all seasons, and the sweat ran in beadlets that the torches made into crawling constellations. Her slippers were silent, and the hem of her gown sounded like a snake in dry grass. She found Lady Celise in the small oratory, rasping a prayer from a page that had known tears. Celise Florent had a face built by angles, and a faith built by deprivation. She wore scarlet as one might wear armor, tight against every doubt. Her hair, grown brittle with winter, was coiled and pinned with sticks of dark wood carved into stags. "You should sleep," Melisandre said quietly. Celise startled, and then gathered herself, proud even in embarrassment. "Sleep is for those who have no work," she said, and touched the seven-pointed star at her throat, as if to remind herself which god she repudiated. "What hour is it? It feels as though the island has decided not to breathe. My lips are chapped." Melisandre stepped beside her so that they were two women before the same poor altar. She remembered to smile the way she had been taught to smile where men needed her to be a lamp. It is the hour when the Lord of Light says a thing twice that it may be heard. Celise's hands clenched. The movement made a ring come loose on one finger. She pressed it back with an irritated motion, then caught herself. "You have seen. I have seen." Celise's eyes were hungry. She had lost the habit of hiding that. "Tell me he is chosen. Tell me my lord husband's patient righteousness has not been overlooked." Tell me all our humiliations were the price of a throne, and that price is nearly paid. Now. Melisandre did not look at her. It was the altar she addressed, or the flame guttering in the dish upon it, or perhaps only the breath between two women who had bound their loneliness to the same name for a god. I saw the crown of antlers, rippled by sea and heat. I saw salt and smoke in a wall whose shadow ate the stars. I saw the grayscale mark upon a cheek, and it was not curse but sign. I saw the child. The word is not prince as the tongue of the seven makes it. It is a word that makes no difference between boy and girl. It is a promise. Now. Salisa's mouth opened and then closed. The color that came into her cheeks made her look, for the first time in many years, almost young. Utter, she said, and the DD caught in her teeth as if it were something rare and dangerous and sweet. My daughter. Our, Melisandre said, and finally set her hand upon Salisa's knuckles. The bones there were thin, the skin thin too, like writing that could be smudged if you pressed too hard. Our light. We must tell the king. Salisa rose too fast. The blood fled her, and she swayed and gripped the edge of the altar, and for an instant, the girl she might have been, had life not chosen to harden, instead of soften, trembled in her. She laughed once, and covered her mouth as though laughter were indecent in a consecrated place. He will say it is madness. No, he will look as if he doubts, and that will be worse. He will look at me as he does when duty and blood stand upon opposite shores. He loves her, Melisandre said. It was not a question. She had weighed every man and woman in this castle the way moneylenders weigh coins. Stannis' love was a flint hidden under many layers of wet cloth. It did not glimmer, but it could still spark and hurt the hand that touched it. He will stand upon the shore where the fire is. They found him in the great round chamber beneath the pointed windows where the painted table ruled. Dawn had not yet edged the glass, but candles served. The painted table was itself a kind of fire. Map turned to altar, mountain ridges and river valleys, and the sprawl of the reach and the crawl of the fingers. Stannis stood hunched over the bladed gullies of the Vale, a man who had been given an incomprehensible task and could not understand why he had asked for it. Sir Davos stood a little back, hand upon the hilt of patience, which was the only weapon he dared draw in the king's presence when Melisandre was in the room. His face was a map of a different sort. Salt-carved, wind-burned lines accrued by loss and laughter. The missing fingers were the emblem the old gods had taken from him when they decided to make him a better man. He saw them and did not smile. But he let relief make a small place in him. There was sweat at his temple for all the cold. He had slept poorly, and the sea had whispered to him of debt. My lord, Salisi said, and Stannis did not look up, which was his way of saying he had heard. Melisandre did not wait for his eyes. I have seen what you asked me to see, she said, because she liked to remind him that he asked. I have seen the one who was promised. Stannis lifted his head. His eyes had blue in them that could be called beautiful if one were not careful. He turned them first upon his wife, and then upon Melisandre, and in neither case did his expression alter. What is this then? The word is not what you have hoped it to be, Melisandre said. The prince, the promised. These are our tongue's tricks. In the sight of our Lord is only the one who bears the light. It is your blood, but it is not you. She stands with a mark upon her face that the world mistook for shame. In the flames it was a sign. Stone that lives, a child who wakes stone with song. Sir Davos did not mean to speak, and so he spoke honestly. No, he said, and then shut his mouth. But the word was there and had to be owned. Begging your pardon, your grace, my lady. He faced the girl he hoped would outlive all their follies by being removed from them. That's a little girl. Stannis' mouth twitched. To men who knew him poorly, it would look like anger. To Davos, who knew the pace of Stannis' breathing when he slept, and the look of his back, when it bore a nation and couldn't straighten, it looked like pain that had gotten ahead of reason. All children are little until they are made big, Stannis said. You think I would set my daughter in harm's way on a red woman's say-so? You think I did not ask her to seek this thing? You think I had not? He stopped himself. He had not allowed himself to think anything about Shireen that could not be armored with duty. Selisa went to him and took his wrist. He did not pull away. It is a grace, she said. A gift. She is chosen. All these years. Stannis, all my shame, the mockery, the whispers that I am unfit root, that I bore you only this will answer them for all time. It is the Lord's doing. Now. Stannis looked at his wife, at the painful hunger in her, then at the Red Woman's unblinking certainty, and then at Davos, whose doubt wore no robes and carried no ruby. He made a face as if he had swallowed something medicinal, and turned toward the door as a knock sounded. Shireen entered a moment later with Maester Pylos at her shoulder, the one man in Dragonstone who knew how to make history sound kind. Book leather scented the little wake they brought. The girl moved with the cautious grace of one who had been told too often to be careful. Her feet learned the lesson thoroughly. She kept both hands around the spine of a book, as if it would jump if not held. The patch of grayscale upon her face was not pretty, but it suffered the candles courteously, and returned them a soft matte shine instead of mockery. On her breast, a small chain of iron keys clicked, gifts from shipwrights and victualers she had charmed without trying. Father. Shireen said, and then, not sure if they were in a private place or a chamber of state, added, Your Grace. Stannis' stiffness altered by an inch. Shireen. Melisandre watched a father and the child who had made a hole in him that air had bothered ever since. She felt the ruby heat at her throat pulse as if something had come near and was curious. She stepped forward. Princess, she said, letting the word announce itself the way a bell might. Shireen's eyes came to her face and then struck the necklace and stayed there. Children were unashamed of that. They stared at what demanded staring. Good morning, Lady Melisandre, she said, as if politeness could transform any hour into good. It's very early. Maester Pylos says the earliest bird eats worms that are still sleeping. Worms begin as eggs, like birds. Pylos murmured, then looked as if he regretted this excursion. Do you know the story of the hero who was promised? Melisandre asked. She kept her voice low and unsharp. Much of her work had been done with edges. This required a cup. Where you were born, there was an island of smoke. Before that, there was a world of darkness. In darkness, a sword was forged. Or it may be that the sword was not iron at all, but a thing you could carry and not have in your hand. Then, Shireen brightened with the reach of a child who had been left too often in rooms where the talk fell above her head like a ceiling. Azor Ahai, she said promptly. He tempered his sword 3 times. The first time in water, and it broke. The second time in a lion's heart, and it broke. The third time she faltered, and her voice became small. She remembered the part of the story that made adults watch her too closely afterward. In his beloved's heart, Melisandre finished, as if it were easy to say. Do you know what the story is about? Shireen's fingers tightened on her book. Not being afraid to do hard things, she said, very solemnly. It is about understanding what the sword is, Melisandre said. She took Shireen's free hand and did not care that Selise flinched with proprietary alarm. The child's palm was small and dry and warmer than one expected. The grayscale's milky rim made a border upon her cheek like careful penmanship. The sword is not what glows. The sword is what goes where fear would forbid. A sword can be a word, or a promise, or a child step into a room where men have filled the air with their breath for years and not thought to share it. Maine? Selisa made a noise like a prayer. Davos said nothing at all. Stannis set his jaw, as if it were a buckle being fastened. The map lay between them all, a wooden country that had not asked to be any of theirs. Melisandre raised Shireen's hand until it hovered over the painted table at the place where Dragonstone jutted like a hooked claw from the narrow sea. Candlelight made a little blessing upon the girl's skin. The Lord of Light has shown me the one who must be taught to sing fire where it has forgotten its song. He does not speak to me of men's pride or crowns. He speaks of a wall where night is piled, and of salt that bites and smoke that cures. Princess, will you take a name from me?" Shireen looked at her father, not at her mother. "What name?" "The promised," Melisandre said, and it surprised her to hear her own voice desire to soften even further, as a woman might lay down a beautiful dagger because a child is in the room, the one who bears the song. In the old tongue the word says only that. In ours it would be prince, but the word is poor and clumsy. Songs cannot wear antlers. Hearts can. Will you be my light? Stannis closed his eyes. Selyse's hands came together below her chin, fingers lacing, unlacing, lacing again. Pylos stared at the floor as if it might be rewritten. Davos found that the sea in his blood had risen to his eyes. He blinked it back and told his hands to be still. Shireen took a breath he could hear from where he stood. "If you think I should," she said to Stannis, because she was 12 and kind. "I will be what the Lord needs." Stannis did not move for the space of 2 breaths. He opened his eyes, and they were clean of everything, except a thing that might have been fear, if it had been allowed to be named. "I do not kneel to riddles," he said, "and I do not throw my daughter into fires." The words echoed, and he let them. "But if the God speaks, I will not be the man who says he chose wrongly. You will be careful of her." He pointed at Melisandre with the same finger he used for maps. "You will not make toys of meanings because you love them so." Melisandre inclined her head. She would accept reproof put thus. "Always, your grace." Selyse moved so quickly it was almost a lunge. She pressed her lips to Shireen's hair, something she had never learned to do without awkwardness. Shireen endured it the way she endured patching and the press of winter wool upon tender skin. She smiled shyly at her father, and for a breath Davos saw, not the scar, not the ring of set salt around her misfortune, but the way light paused to consider her and decided to stay a moment. They made a rite of it that night, because men require shape for meaning and candles for courage. Melisandre directed the servants to strip the old sept of its icons and to smoke the rafters with resin and cinnamon. They set shallow braziers along the nave and drew back the shutters so the sea might look on. Torches bit the air. The castle's populace came at a murmur's call. Armorer and scullions. The boy who drove hooks through shutters when storms threatened. 2 men-at-arms who had lost brothers to wildfire. A girl whose mother had fled a lord's justice and found in kitchen drudgery a quieter kind. Melisandre felt each of them as one feels the heat radiating from a circle of men around a pit after a battle. She dressed Shireen in plain white, not scarlet. Selyse argued. "Scarlets were for chosen," she said. Purity was a color she had never found useful in her own house, and she distrusted it. Melisandre had already decided. "Candles are brave because they begin white and end black," she said. "The Lord loves both moments." To Selyse's shock, Shireen smiled at that and touched her cheek where the stone made a sleeping mask. "I will be brave like a candle," she said. They set her at the head of the nave beneath the window that peered like a dragon's eye upon the sea. Melisandre set a dish of salt before her, and a dish of ash and a basin of clear water, brought up from a spring the castle forgot in its belly. She laid her own hands upon the child's head and felt the hummingbird tremor at the base of the skull. Shireen's palms lay open upon her knees, as if she offered even the hollows of herself. Selyse stood behind her daughter with fingers digging into the linen at her sides. Stannis took no position. He stood near and apart, and his apartness had always been a part of his nearness. It would be written on his tomb that he could not be had without measurement. Melisandre, T. The tune had no words and too many. She had learned it in a city whose stones had absorbed rotting fruit and abuse in equal measure. Learn it from a woman with a throat ruined by wine, who had nonetheless taught 100 children how to make air obey. She sang, and the braziers bowed their flames toward her, like men acknowledging a newfound lord. She sang, and the sea answered on its own time. She sang, and Shireen's thin shoulders loosened a fraction. and the grayscales cold slept. Salt, Melisandre said, because names must be given for things to stay, and she pressed 2 fingers to the dish, and then drew them across Shireen's brow as a mother might soothe fever. Smoke, she said, and touched the ash, and smeared it gently upon the child's hairline where baby hair had once sprung. Song, she said last, and reached, not to the basin, not to the fire, but to the space above Shireen's left palm, and drew there an invisible sign which burned her fingertip and left no mark upon the child at all. She felt something turn in the air then, a wheel that had waited long enough. The torches guttered and then flared without draft. The sea answered 100 heartbeats later. One long sigh that smoothed the shingle below like a mother's hand smoothing a child's hair. Pylos dropped his book, and the sound made several people laugh. The quick, nervous laugh that calls up courage more reliable than any god's. Davos felt the prickle that runs along a sailor's arms when lightning finds a mast. He closed his eyes against remembering Blackwater's green fear. When he opened them, Shireen was looking directly at him with a steadiness he had not seen in her before. "Sir Davos," she said, her voice carrying because silence loved it. "Will you stay near me, please?" The request made ash in Melisandre's mouth. Not because she doubted the man's loyalty, but because she knew the old gods of habit hold power that rivals prophecy. Davos bowed, because that was how his body had learned to say yes long before his mind did. "As it please your..." The word hung. He found he could not say grace. Not because she lacked it, but because the title made a game of something that was not a game. "Shireen," she said to his relief. "If you keep saying princess at me, I shall trip on it." It had been a proper rite. It would have been proper even if no fire had heated and no sea had breathed. Men need verses given to them when lung and heart do not agree. But something had heated, and in the days that followed Dragonstone, altered the way a face alters when a man learns he has been seen and not likes it and cannot help it. The island's mists came ashore with more purpose. The gulls returned their complaints. Patchface danced through the yard in bells dulled by damp and sang the same nonsense. But some of his nonsense began to rhyme with the hours. "Under the sea, the sun is a candle," he chirped, "and the candle is a sun, and the fish cook themselves if you wait long enough." Shireen was the only one besides Melisandre who did not shrink from him. She made a seat for him with her own hands on a low wall, and told him he could sit so long as he did not sing the verse about the drowned wedding when the wind came out of the east. She went to Melisandre's chamber every night at a different hour, because Melisandre had decided that discipline begins in the heel and works up. She learned to watch fire without wanting too much from it. She learned to speak the names of the 7 colors a flame wears when it has nothing to hide, and not to ask for the 8th color whose name men cannot carry and keep the rest of their words intact. Melisandre made her hold her hands over coals until the line between pain and fear sharpened, and then withdraw and name the feeling. She told her the story of a girl who once swallowed the last hot coal from the last fire in a city that had decided it preferred darkness, and how the girl had carried the coal in her stomach like a secret child until she could deliver it into new wood. Shireen did not ask if the girl had a name. She learned to forget her own questions when the lesson required it, and to remember them later alone. And those questions ripened like fruit kept in a cool cellar. In the daylight hours she kept to her old comforts. Pylos read to her, and then she read to him when his throat tired. She tried to teach Letterbear, her cat, to sit upon maps without putting his tail upon the riverlands. But cats are faithless students. She visited the rookery to watch the ravens blacken and lighten as clouds passed the arrow slit. She took her mother's hand in the oratory when she saw that the fingers were white and vibrationless with the cold of piety. She stood in the yard with Davos and begged stories from him about the peasant girl who had built a hut of fish bones and found it good enough for royalty. He told them, and sometimes he left out the versions where the royal had stolen the hut, and sometimes he left them in, depending on the sky. Stannis did not alter. Only those who had watched him long would see that he now paused before entering rooms. as if he were learning to knock at the door of the household in his own chest. He did not jest, but he allowed in the silences between orders a longer rope than before. He came twice to Melisandre's chamber while Shireen was there. He stood in the doorway. He watched. He left without being certain which of his hungers he had fed. He practiced with Lightbringer on mornings when the wind allowed a man to feel his hands. It glowed dutifully, the way a faithless hound follows the man who gives it meat. Melisandre watched from her window and kept her own counsel. Once, when Shireen was there, the sword's light faltered as if a fish had flicked its tail through a candle. Stannis swore, and Melisandre looked down for the first time in any ritual, and felt her throat resist a word she had never thought to say. Enough! The sword brightened. Shireen was humming. When Melisandre asked what tune it was, she said, "It's Patchface's song about candles becoming suns." "I'm practicing making the wrong song right." News came, as news does, carried by men who have learned to make walking an errand, and by birds who have learned to make hunger a trade. War, rumor, the king across the sea, the kings who were never kings. Stannis' jaw worked. He listened to letters like a man who does not like music and must sit through a concert for love of the musician. He spoke to his captains in curt sheets. They took them and shuffled them until they looked like sails. He sent the letter that would become a winter pilgrimage. To the wall, to the night's watch, to a duty that did not glitter. Melisandre did not argue the direction. The flames had put the wall in her mouth like a coin, and it had warmed there. She told him there would be a passage through cold that is not like other cold. She told him he would have to consider what a sword meant when swords were brittle as truth. "You will bring her." She said of Shireen, and he flared without heat. "No," Stannis said, and for once he did not put reason between himself and his heart. "Prophecy or no, I will not make the wall her tutor." "It is already," Melisandre said. "It is the black line drawn under your life. Do not leave the child ignorant of what rights you." She did not speak of danger. She knew better than to present him with that morsel. He would set his teeth and tear it, and not taste the meal. "You fear for her because you love her. Good. Bring your fear to the same place you bring your sword." Khaleesi surprised them both by agreeing. "The north is where gods are made honest," she said. And her eyes shone with rapture that had nothing to do with weather. "I will bring her if you will not." Stannis stood between his wife and the red woman and the map, and for almost a full minute he looked, simply looked, at his daughter where she balanced upon one foot to scratch her calf with the other. A child again for that blink, a very human creature with itches and little skills to answer them. When he spoke, he seemed to have rehearsed defeat and found that it did not fit his mouth. "She will come," he said. "Davos will keep her on the earth if she looks too long at the sky." Salad Horsan laughed when Davos told him, a laugh like a jeweled purse falling open. "Ah, onion," he said, flexing the ring on his little finger, because sailors must remind themselves of luck, even when talking to friends. "What is it to you to shepherd a lamb through winter? You are used to shepherding wolves with hungry bellies and hungry hearts. A girl who reads books is easy." "Bah! You have not met her," Davos said, and his tone made Saladhor tilt his head and look at him the way men look at other men when they realize the river has cut a new course without their noticing. They sailed when the island had no choice but to let them go. Dragonstone clung at their sterns as mist. Then, when a fickle wind punched its cheeks, it slid aside and fell into memory, as all homes do when the sea makes them small. The fleet was modest and pugnacious, like a pack of dogs convinced they have a bear among them, and not caring to name which. Stannis' warship cut the water with the satisfied, sullen look of a woman carrying double. Shireen stood at the bow beneath a cloak that had swallowed her twice, and now consented to share. Davos put her hand upon the rail where the tar was not too tacky, and showed her how the sea gathers its shoulders before it throws them. "It smells different," she said, And he did not ask different from what, because he could smell Dragonstone receding and the wall approaching, which is to say he could smell stone and blood cooling, and something like clean fear. Every bite of it is a place, Davos said. You go far enough out, and you think it is all one place. It isn't. The sea remembers every river mouth and every leak of a fisherman's wife's tears. What do tears taste like? She asked, and then looked abashed. Salt. That was silly. Maester Pylos says the taste of a thing is a language, and it wasn't silly, Davos said gruffly. What do they taste like besides salt? They taste like everything you put in them. Want, bite, shame, relief. You can taste a lie in a man's tears if he isn't good at lying. Don't tell him that. It will make him better at it. Damn. She laughed, which made a midshipman forget to coil a rope and earn himself a cuff from a bosun who did not believe laughter kept men from drowning. Patchface, who they had almost left behind, because there are follies that even love cannot justify, capered dangerously near a hatch until Davos caught him by the belt and placed him like cargo on a coil of line. Under the sea the men are birds, Patchface sang. And the women are fish, and the little girls are brave candles that float like ships. He shook his bells, and the bells, which had rust in their throats from storms they had swallowed, coughed up a music that would have sounded like prophecy if prophecy had not been busy elsewhere. Melisandre stood aft under a canopy that never shook rain off its edges because rain refused to acknowledge her. She watched Shireen as a smith watches a blade he has just quenched. So much can warp in cooling. So much can crack if you ask it to be what it isn't. When Stannis came to stand near her, she did not tell him what she was thinking. It is a kind of love, withholding the worst truths until they are truths no longer. My daughter is not a god, he said to her without preface, because he preferred to stab the air rather than let it suspect. Speak as you please to the others. To me, speak as to a man whose hand will be on the tiller until he can no longer feel his fingers. Your hand is on the tiller because she will need a path through ice that is not on the maps. Melisandre said, I will not ask you to worship her. I will ask you to listen to her when she says the rope is pulled too tight and the sail cannot bear it. Then see. He made that almost smile again, the one that makes weak men mistake him for cold. Davos will listen, he said. Davos will love her, Melisandre said, allowing the word to stand in the wind, which took it, and turned it a few times, and decided to return it whole. At night the sea had the color of iron that had been in a fire and then forgotten outside the forge. Shireen came to Melisandre's tent despite her mother's fussy protest, and sat cross-legged with a brazier between them and practiced calling the edges of flame by their names. The ship rocked, and the coals answered. The wall, she said once, with no prompt. It's not only stone, it's stories that learned how to stand. It's men who got tired of walking. It's a song so old the words are only humming. Melisandre let the girl's words pass over her skin. There is a time for correcting and a time for harvesting. When you see it, you will be afraid, she said. You must learn the difference between the fear that says, this cliff is high and the rocks hard, and the fear that says, this song is too beautiful and I cannot sing it. The first fear keeps you alive. The second keeps you small. You will not be small long. Shireen looked up, startled, and Melisandre wished the startle away. Not because she did not love to make people startle, but because she wanted this woman-child to learn to bend before shocks rather than judge herself by them. The ruby at Melisandre's throat beat twice and then steadied. It snowed as they climbed the coast. Shireen wrapped her hands in wool the color of the inside of a pear. Selise wrapped herself in rectitude. Stannis wrapped himself in plans. Davos took each hour and wrapped it in common sense, then offered it to whomever would take it. Several men took it and were saved from doing something brave and stupid in a squall. Salladhor cursed, because snow behaves like fire at sea. It makes liars of men who think they can weigh it. By the time the frost bit the rigging and left its teeth prints, ravens had found them. They fell upon the yards like night. Pylos coaxed them down with tidbits and told them it was not their business to be mystical. One bird, cleverer than its brothers or more ambitious, landed upon Shireen's wrist as if she were a branch. She did not flinch. The bird's weight surprised her and then pleased her. It pecked at the grayscale patch and then blinked as if chastened. "You are a rude thing," she told it. And it crouched and made a sound like a lock, considering. "What will you do with a wall?" Davos asked her on a day when the shore was a smear of charcoal, and the world seemed content not to begin anywhere for a while. "When you find it, listen," she said. "I think it must be like a very large old man who pretends to sleep. If you tell him boring things, he will go on pretending. If you tell him a story he has not heard, he might open one eye. And if I sing at him, perhaps he will open both. Not so he can walk, so he can look properly, so he can look." "You have a queer head," Davos said affectionately. "You're lucky nobody thinks queer heads win wars. They only make songs about them afterward." Now, damdish. She did not understand all of that. She understood enough to laugh again, and Davos could not hate the Red Woman entirely while he was hearing that. The sound lodged under his breastbone and warmed him when the wind cut. They came at last to Eastwatch's hard timbers, to its smell of tar and iron and men who had forgotten what softness felt like, and were proud of that. The watch met them not with trumpets, but with guarded gratitude, as if they had been expecting a bill collector and a neighbor came instead with a basket. Stannis went to speak of vows and rights and necessity. Selisa went to count sins she could fix. Melisandre went to stand beneath the shadow of the wall and feel it offer neither welcome nor scorn. Only the truth of a thing that was what it was and would be stubborn about being otherwise. Shireen went to the base of the ice and put her hand upon it. It burned her through her glove, and she withdrew and put the glove to her mouth and laughed at the pain because laughter made room for it in her. Davos stood with his hands behind his back and remembered being a boy in a cave, hearing a palace of ice groan above him and deciding to live despite that. "Hello," Shireen said to the wall, absurd and correct. "I'm sorry I'm small. I'll make my voice tall." The ice said nothing. The wind translated. It always does, and always badly. But something in the high cold said, in a tongue that cannot do gender, a word like a nod. That night, when the fires were mean, and the air filigreed every beard, Melisandre dreamed a dream without heat. In it, she was small again, the size of a thought in a fearful head, and she stood at the bottom of an ocean of glass. Above her, the world pressed white. She said the child's name, and it made a crack run to the left like a smile being considered. She said the child's name again, and the crack ran to the right like a compromise. She said the name a third time, and the crack did not join to make a break. It made an opening. When she woke, the brazier at her feet had gone to gloom, and her ruby lay quiet on her breast. Outside, the wind had hitched itself to the eaves and shook like a dog coming out of water. She went to the flap and looked out. The wall browsed the stars at its own leisure. It did not mind being looked at. It did not care to be touched without invitation. She smiled, and the smile had a private shape, like a dagger hung in a closet behind a dress. Shireen stood not 50 paces away with a lamp cupped in both palms, a little bright servant carrying its master respectfully. The girl's face was uplifted. Melisandre could not see her mouth, but she knew it would be slightly parted, as if breath itself were a word being formed carefully. The lamp's light made a honey coin upon the ice, and it faltered, and then steadied, as if a wind had thought to take it, and then surrendered to good manners. "Sing," Melisandre whispered, though she did not think the child could hear her. Shireen did. It was not Patchface's song, nor was it one of Salisa's iron exercises in righteousness, nor was it a prayer Melisandre had taught her, though it knew enough of that cadence to borrow it. It was the sound a girl makes when she remembers that she is permitted to delight. It was stubborn and shy and persistent. She sang, and the lamp shook twice, and then found a stillness that did not belong to still air, but to a hand steadied from within. The wall did not answer. Not yet. It does not do anything yet in the stories worth listening to. But the watchman on the east parapet, who had thought himself too old to hear anything that did not blow, turned his head by an inch and touched with his forefinger the edge of the pitted stone beside him, as if to say, "There, you feel that too." In the morning, Stannis put on his duty and went to speak of levy and cost. Selise put on her devotions and went to count which men might be improved, if someone loved them properly, and whether she might be that someone, if she made her love sharp enough. Davos wrapped his cloak, which had once been fine and was now only honest, around his shoulders, and went to find what small work he could make bigger, which is a sailor's gift and curse. Melisandre stood where the ice meets the living air and lifted her hands and did not light a fire. She felt the light that had nothing to do with flame, and learned whether she was brave enough to let it not be hers. Shireen the Promised, who had been a child before anyone named it, and would be a child after, until the day childhood was no longer enough to carry the weight in her, sat with Pylus and asked for a history that did not have a king in the title. He gave her one about a miller's daughter who persuaded a river to move its banks so her village might drink and not drown. "How did she persuade it?" Shireen asked. "She sang," he said, surprised, because the book did not say so, but it was clearly true now that the child had asked. Shireen hummed the first bar of the tune she had made and stopped, because she was 12, and the world had taught her certain shames. Pylos did not look at her in a way that would break that. He pretended he had not heard, and told her about the way the river keeps its secrets in a braid that a patient woman can comb. Somewhere beyond mapping, men who had chosen a different god and none at all moved rocks and names and grief across a board that had no edges. Somewhere ghosts rehearsed an old anger. Somewhere the sea remembered a treasure of bones and decided it needed company. The world felt itself tilt by the breadth of a girl's song and did not know it had done so. The Red Woman did, and smiled without it making war upon her face. "Lightbringer," Stannis said to his sword as he sheathed it for the work of politics, "will do what I tell it to," and for once it did not flare, and he did not mind. He looked across the yard to where his daughter listened to a history that was not a crown. He let himself count her breaths the way men count coins after a lean year, and each breath made him a little richer. Under the wall, frost etched tiny cathedrals upon a brazier that had fallen into disuse. And when the first weak sun reached them, they did not melt all at once, but retreated like an army with dignity, leaving the memory of their spires in the air. Shireen saw them and clapped, and then pretended she had merely brushed her hands clean of ash. Melisandre saw the pretense and loved it as one loves the lie a child tells because she thinks the truth has to be hidden to be valuable. "Tomorrow," she said, standing at the threshold between wind and room, "we will ask the wall a question it has not heard." "What question?" Shireen asked, unable not to leap. "How it learned to listen," Melisandre said, "and let the riddle do what riddles do. Tether a bright creature to a problem so that the leash teaches it to pull." When the lamps went out and the kind of dark arrived that still believes in stars, a watchman on the east gate began to hum and did not know why the tune made his eyes wet. Davos, in his narrow bed, dreamed of salt that did not sting and woke with the taste of it, like tears offered without shame, in his mouth. Selise woke before her prayers and lay perfectly still, not with fear but with the unfamiliar weight of something on her chest that was not duty. Stannis woke into the night 3 wretched times and each time heard, not a child crying in fear, but a child's note woven into wind, and the sound made him hate no man, not even the one he would have to hate by morning. Melisandre slept at last and did not dream. Rest came to her like a truce does to a warrior who has learned to distrust it and cannot help taking it anyway. Dawn did not break so much as it eased its forearms onto the parapet and looked over. Snow grinned in the seams of the stones and chose not to fall. In the quiet before orders and quarrels and the daily liturgy of surviving, Shireen stepped to the ice and put her hands upon it, and the cold bit, and she let it, and she owed it, and she opened her mouth as if to take a bite of morning, and she began to sing again. Low, without bravery, without shyness, not trying to be large, just true. The wall listened, or it did not. The difference would be told in the days to come, in the way breaths were counted, in the way swords chose their own meanings, in the way a nation at last might learn that songs are sometimes stronger than fires if you teach them how to burn. And far beneath them all, in rock that had never loved a human foot, Something old and patient rolled over and decided whether to go on sleeping slightly to the left or slightly to the right, and the choice, being small, was enormous. Kai. The day found its way in by quiet degrees, as if the light had learned from the black stone how to move without announcing itself. Frost clung to ropes and to the wool on men's sleeves, and to the lashes of the horse that stamped and blew in a white speech only other horses understood. The wall did not glitter. It had a way of swallowing glitter and turning it into something the eye could not quite keep. Shireen stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves and watched breath make itself visible. She wanted to name each puff to keep it from being lost. Davos watched her wanting and said nothing, because a man ruins more than he mends when he reaches to help where no help is needed. Cotter Pike came down the steps from the watch platform and made the yard accept him by the authority of his walk. He was short and built like a quarrel meant for a crossbow that had forgotten to leave the bow. He wore his beard as if it were a task he had accepted out of stubbornness. His eyes were small and black, and held the kind of humor that sustains men in places where laughter freezes before it finishes a word. He looked over Stannis' men the way a man looks over a horse he means to ride, even if it would rather bite him. "Your Grace," he said to Stannis without bowing farther than a spine used to the wall would allow. "Eastwatch is as you see it. You'll find no carpets. We've kept a set of manners for high company in a chest. They mold as soon as you put them on." Stannis nodded as if he had expected as much of men in chests. "I have not come for carpets," he said. "I have come for men who remember they are men." Cotter's mouth let out a breath that might have been laughter if one felt generous. "We remember," he said. "We remember so hard it keeps us from sleep. Your priest makes my lads twitch. You've brought enough red cloth to hang 1,000 traitors. This isn't a Southron holdfast. There's a way of getting along at the end of the world, and it isn't improved by lighting it on fire because the dark looks at you wrong." "The dark does not look," Melisandre said. And he turned toward her with a professional dislike. "It eats. Your men come home with bites taken that no tooth made." Cotter scratched his ear with a dirty thumb. "You talk like a man who's learned to sell knives to folk already cut," he said. "If there's eating to be done, the wall keeps most mouths shut. It's done so since men better than any of us decided not to go south when they could have. If you want to help, help. If you want to help, help. If you want to teach, you'll find few pupils. They're busy living." Shireen liked him at once. It was not the rudeness. She did not care for rudeness. It was the way he set words as if he were laying stones across a river where children had to cross. "Sir," she said before anyone could stop her, "do you know any songs the wall likes?" Cotter stared as if someone had slipped something into his stew. Something in his face loosened and then pretended it had not. "Eh," he said grudgingly. "A long one with no tune. We hum it with our boots. I'm learning to hum with my throat." Shireen said, "Maybe the wall will let me make a harmony if I don't push." Cotter looked at Stannis, not for permission but for amusement. Stannis' face did not oblige. "Keep to the lower steps when you're humming," Cotter told Shireen. "The upper ones will throw you if they don't like what you're saying." She smiled and filed the advice beside the names of the flame's colors. There was a day for business, and Stannis ate it bones and all. The ravens were sent. The charts that had belonged to men long in the ground were unrolled and pressed flat beneath mugs and knives. Cotter showed where the sea had been unseasonably greedy. Hardhome marked with a dull nail and a grim word. "Don't." Scouts reported wildling fires south of the wall. A drift of smoke here. A sparkle of orange there. No chorus yet, but the tune rehearsed. The talk was of horses and shoes and oats and grain cakes and salt beef that had to be convinced each morning not to become rocks. It was all a kind of prayer. Selisa built a chapel from disused timbers in a corner of the yard and carried in her own indignation as an altarpiece. The queen's men hammered and sang a soldier's hymn that had learned the new god's name and put it to old habitudes. Melisandre let them. It was a good thing for men to believe the flames were theirs, while the flames taught them otherwise. She kept Shireen's lessons apart from spectacle. There are fires you show to a crowd, and fires you keep cupped in 2 hands, and do not share until they have decided to be more than candle. On the third day, when the sea threw sleet at the stones like a creditor, Melisandre watched the child set the lamp upon a ledge of ice, and tilt it until the wick licked, not at the air, but toward the wall itself. She sang a line so small a man might think it a mistake. The flame bent, and then resumed. The wall released nothing a human ear could claim as answer. Melisandre, who owned more kinds of listening than most, felt a pressure in the cold as when a door within a summer house tightens in its frame at noon. The ruby at her throat warmed as if it had been pressed between palms. "Again," she said. Shireen sang the line backward, and the lamp guttered, and then recovered, and a flake of frost leapt from the ice and spun and landed in Shireen's open palm, and did not melt. She giggled, and then closed her hand a little, and the flake let go of its shape and ran between her fingers as clean water. She licked the wetness because a child must, and her face decided the taste before any adult could tell it what to decide. Salt. She said, and something like iron, only kind. Davos watched with contained alarm as a man watches a child stand in a doorway with wind tugging at her garments, and cannot shout because the shout would push her where the wind would not. He kept his place and told his hands to be patient. After the lesson, he took Shireen to the kitchen where the heat did not need rubies to make it honest, and showed her how a cook keeps a fire that must last the day, not blaze and die to look clever. She listened to that lesson with the same respect she gave the other. When she went back to her mother, she smelled of smoke that had boiled cabbages and dried mittens and warmed a bushel of potatoes. Selise clucked and smoothed her hair and did not comment on the smell, because the sight of the child made something soft and frightened in her chest, and she knew if she spoke of one thing she might have to speak of the other. That night, the Red Woman dreamed no dreams, and that told her more than dreaming would have. She woke into a stillness in which a man's thoughts could be heard if one pressed an ear to the air. Somewhere a guard shuffled his feet and then stilled them because he imagined his captain's disapproval rising like a specter out of the snow. Somewhere on the sea, a fox tested a root and decided men had already claimed it. Somewhere in Stannis' tent, a father counted the ways there are to lose a daughter and told himself each one was an enemy to be faced in order. Morning took its time. Shireen's song took none at all. It arrived as if it had been waiting behind her teeth for days. Cotter, who had no religion but duty, paused at the top of a stair and felt the tiny hairs on his wrist lift, and he told himself it had been the wind. Pylos, who had read more than he had believed and believed more than he had read, closed a page on a tale of an old door and allowed himself one, exactly one, thought that was not fit for a maester. Please. They made a journey along the wall's foot not long after that, because Melisandre's fire had shown her a shape that would not stay still. A mouth and roots, a memory that had learned to be wood, a gate that did not ask for keys. She did not name the night fort to Selise until Selise had made up her mind to object. Then the name had to be swallowed along with pride. A haunt, Selise said. Rats and stories. Rats and stories are the architecture of the world, Melisandre said. The wall is not a wall of ice only. It is a wall of things men told it. There is a place along it where the oldest telling sleeps. If we wake it kindly, it will answer kindly. Stannis refused to be seen to deliberate. If there is magic there useful to my purpose, I will be told of it, he said. You will take men. Davos will go because the gods like to laugh, and put him where there's danger I cannot afford to see. Davos did not protest. His face kept to its habit of resignation. Inwardly he tried on each likely fear like a man trying on cloaks. None fit well enough to make him turn back. Shireen, told she would come, whispered a thank you that made Selise's mouth compress, and then relent. If you see a rat, Selise said, do not try to make a pet of it. They went on sledges along the ragged line where stone and ice teach each other stubbornness. Men of the watch came. 3 of Cotter's choosing, the kind of men who have learned not to be curious until curiosity is the only tool left. Patchface came until Davos put his hands on the fool's shoulders and turned him gently around. You'll dance your bells off those steps, he said. And Patchface, wounded, improvised a step that somehow obeyed and defied the admonition at once. The night fort rose up with the kind of patience old things own. It had broken and been mended and given up aspects of itself without becoming less. An arch stood, and beside it, its twin had gone to rubble and rooted itself. The kitchens had grown a crust of ice like a pie left too long on a sill in winter and forgotten. A tower stooped as if to tell a secret. Davos could smell old smoke trapped under ice, a smell like time's pockets turned inside out. They stood in the dim, where light could not do its usual arrogant tricks. Pylos turned his lore over like coins in his sleeve. "There's a well," he said carefully. "I have read of it. The oldest men, the stories say, that there is a door," Melisandre finished. "Words make doors. Some you can touch. The ones that matter most open without a hand if you have the song. But some doors were made with a bargain stitched into their hinges." She looked at Shireen. "We will ask and accept the answer." They went down. The steps declared their age by telling the feet to reconsider what they thought they knew about rhythm. The well shaft greeted them with the smell of stone that had drunk things and not complained. Ice made a skin in places where water still remembered how to move. There was a face in the roots. Melisandre saw it first because she was looking for it. But Davos saw it a heartbeat later because his mind had been tuned by fear to expect mouths where none should be. The mouth was a mouth and not. Lips that were wood. Teeth like pale old seeds. The eyes were not eyes, but emptiness rimmed by living stuff so slow, it might as well have been a prayer petrified. "Hush," Melisandre said, but not to anyone in particular. Shireen looked at the face and did not feel any of the childhood terrors that had so often had their way with her when darkness grew a shape and insisted on being counted. She felt instead the peculiar calm that had come upon her when she had decided to nurse a hurt bird, despite knowing the bird would die. She stepped forward until Davos' breath touched the back of her head. "Hello," she said for the second time to something that would not answer in a human voice. "We don't want to take anything that belongs to you. We want to leave something that might make it easier for you to stand. If you don't want it, I will take it away." The roots twisted nothing. The wood sighed nothing. And yet the air knew to allow a silence there that had a shape, and that shape told them they were being heard. Melisandre bowed her head because there are older gods than the one she serves, and she has learned not to give offense in their houses when she can help it. She let the child begin. Shireen did not sing the tune she had been practicing on the wall. She did not sing a tune at all. She spoke on a breath that did not form words, the way a woman coaxes a feverish child to drink. The sound had no cleverness. It had no ambition. It had what a fisherman's net has when it goes empty into water and comes back full. Trust. "For men," said the mouth in the roots, "if it spoke, and it did not. For men who say the words and mean them, I open. I know." Shireen said softly, "I cannot ask to go. I didn't swear." She looked over her shoulder at Davos, and he felt the strangest impulse to kneel. "Will you say the words?" she asked him. Davos' hands remembered the feel of rope when the sea has its mind up. He looked at the face and felt the weight of oaths he had made that had cost him less than this one would. He thought of Stannis and of the long habit of obedience that had taken him out of gutters and into councils. He thought of his boys. He thought of the bones he had carried for years and then thrown away because a king had made a better sign of them than he ever could. He thought of what the watch was meant to be, and the small, clever voice that says, "You will call yourself a fool for this," could not be heard over the slow, loud beat of his heart. "I will say them," he said, "if I may." Cotter Pike would have laughed until the ice sweated if he had been there to hear it. He was not. Pylos stared as if grammar had betrayed him. Khaleesi made a sound, and then did not repeat it, because the place had taught her in one instant what her prayers had not in years. That there are rooms where your love is not the largest thing. Davos knelt in the damp. He said the words in a voice that had learned all its tricks on deck, shouting into wind, muttering into coils of line, cursing when required and praying only when no one watched. He promised nights and winters and all the small days that go between, and he said he would be the sword and the shield, because those are the tidy versions of hard work men have learned to keep in their mouths. He gave up children he could not give up, because they had already been taken. He gave up lands he had never wanted because he had only ever wanted the right to work and eat in the same day. He thought the words would choke him at some point. They went out as if they had always been his. The face moved then, or it did not. The mouth opened. The black behind it was not a black a man fears. It was the black of water at night when you trust the man at the tiller. A breath of air touched Davos' cheeks and felt like a hand considering whether to bless him. He did not move. The door had opened for him. He did not test it. He stood and put his palm on Shireen's hair and felt that his hand trembled and told it not to be ashamed. "Thank you," Shireen said to the door, the way she thanked the kitchen boy who brought her an apple when she had not asked for one. "We have what we came for." "Which is what?" Selyse asked, effort making her voice brittle. "Proof that the old songs haven't gone deaf," Melisandre said. "And a man apprenticed to the smallest oath and the largest place." Davos did not feel any different. He did not expect to. The changes that last begin as a discomfort in the fit of your clothes. On the climb back to air, he heard Patchface singing very faintly in his head. "Under the sea, the doors have lips," and surprised himself by not resenting the fool for once. They made their way back to Eastwatch beneath a sky that had decided to be generous with its color. The snow kept to the edges like a humbled crowd. The sea held its iron peace. Men saluted them absent-mindedly because the wall trains men to salute anything that might be a threat or a friend. "You leave yourself fewer enemies that way." Stannis listened to the account and gave the smallest nod a man can give without it being mistaken for a tick. Selyse took Shireen's hands and warmed them between her own and then told her she must wash, which was the way she said, "I am afraid of losing you." That night Melisandre fed the brazier in her tent with driftwood that had come ashore with stories clinging to it, and the flames accepted and told her one of their own. She saw a line of riders move through trees that had learned to bear snow like a second bark. She saw banners that had unlearned their colors, and one that had never owned any color and did not need to because men knew it by its shape. She saw the wild host beyond, a bonfire of need and hunger and bravado and love of their own sort. And in the middle a man who had taught himself to be a king because no one else had remembered to do it for them. She did not see the end of the riders' charge because the fire rolled back and showed her only gray. And the sound a sword makes, when it meets a truth, it cannot dull. The vision left heat behind her eyes. She blinked it away and lifted the ruby, and felt it beat with the distant thrum of a wall on the brink of learning a new word. Stannis moved the next morning with that economy of gesture men mistake for cold. He spoke his intent. He would take horse along the base of the wall, and then south to where the trees watched the castles, with the suspicion of old men in a public house. He would bring steel where steel's word is still understood. He would put his name into men's mouths who had forgotten their own. Cotter offered men who could ride and men who could run as long as horses, and men who could fall and get up without asking the ground why it had done that to them. Stannis took what was offered and what was required and nothing more. He looked at his daughter and looked away and then looked back. A small movement that cost him more than a feint in battle. "You will not come," he said to her, and this time there was no argument. "You will keep this place from forgetting itself. Davos will." He paused, and in the pause there was a century of habits breaking and being mended. Davos will do his duty on both counts. "I will try," Davos said. "You will do," Stannis returned, and the moment was mended by that as he had intended. Selyse made lists in her head of what she would do to make the watch better, richer in righteousness, less given to sloth. She found that her lists broke apart when Shireen's voice hummed under them. She learned the hum and did not forgive herself for liking it. Pylos brought a book about the building of impossible things, and discovered in conversation with the child that she could tell him which parts were lies, not because she had the lore, but because she had learned what lies sound like when they're proud of themselves. Cotter worked and watched, and did not decide what he thought about a world in which a king listens to a red woman and a child tells a wall what tune to take. He had learned the only decision that lasts is the one you make, when the ladder breaks under you, and you either jump right or left. Men came to him with questions. He fed them answers that had kept him alive. And if those answers had been changed by the song, he pretended not to hear. He did not say so. The first letters from the west came with ravens that had learned to tuck one wing against the wind and fly crooked to keep their lives. The words said the wildlings were pressing at the trees, not yet a tide, more like a series of heavy waves you miscount and regret. The word said firelight on the wrong side of the wall was common as a man cursing. The word said men in black were dying in ones and twos, and sometimes tens, and that the snow drank them greedily and did not even blush. Stannis read the messages with his jaw set and his breath steady, and asked for the shortest route through the densest wood. On a day that could not decide whether to be clear or sullen, Shireen went to the wall alone and put both palms, bare, upon the ice. She held until pain stopped being a shout and became an instruction. She whispered something. The lamp stood at her feet like a patient dog. The flame lengthened without growing. It laid itself against the ice, not as attack, but as offering. The line of light slid and stilled, and then, almost shyly, pressed forward. For the first time, a sound came from within the ice that any man would admit hearing. A small, interrogative crack. Shireen broke off and stepped back at once. The flame returned to its cup. The crack did not extend into harm. It held where it began, like an eyebrow raised and then lowered with a thought kept. Melisandre let herself breathe. "Good," she said. "What did it say?" Shireen asked. "That it isn't death," Melisandre said, "and that you must not be greedy." "I won't," Shireen said, and meant it the way children mean promises they have made without being asked. A watchman on the east parapet, a man with a wife he had not seen in 10 years, and did not trust his memory to recall properly anymore, wiped his eye and told himself it had been sleet. Pylos wrote a letter in a careful hand to no one, describing a fact for which the Citadel had no slot. He did not send it. Selisa lit 3 candles in her chapel, and kept them from drowning in their own tears of fat with a look. Davos walked the yard like a man who had just given away something that had been his long enough to learn his shape, and felt lighter and sadder, and less his own than before, and decided that must be what oaths are for. Stannis left the following dawn with the riders. Their hooves kicked up snow that looked less like flight and more like stubbornness given forward direction. A standard snapped in a wind that did not respect heraldry. Melisandre stood beneath the wall and did not wave. She does not show men the parts of love that make them turn back. Shireen watched until the riders had become punctuation marks upon a page, and then smudges, and then the part of a story where you turn the leaf and find the next line darker for having waited. When the camp's noises thinned, the wall's own small languages became audible again. Ice sings. When it is sure no one listens. Shireen went to her lamp. She did not light it. Not every song needs a flame, she told Melisandre. And Melisandre, who had spent a life telling flames what they were for, nodded and was content to be taught. Days fell into the habit of winter. The Queen's men tried to make converts and succeeded in making enemies, and then, surprised, tried to mend what they had broken with soups and shared hands at hauling, and discovered that kindness is a door a wall will open even for men she distrusts. Patchface kept his balance too often for chance. Once in the yard, he slipped and would have cracked his skull on a stone worn to the shape of 100 knees if Shireen had not reached him with a speed that surprised them both. He ended in her arms, his bells clinking in contrition. "Under the sea, all the rats are kings," he told her solemnly. "And the kings are rats." She kissed his cheek, where his painted motley had faded into the mottling of years, and said, "Then we must be kind to rats." Ravens brought a letter from a place whose name made cotters in the outbuildings cross themselves with the old sign. The hand was cramped. The words smelled like smoke. The message was simple. Hold. Stannis had reached trees thick enough to make cavalry into a series of men, and he was learning how to break and bend into what the land wanted from him. There was a man to meet at Castle Black who knew the wildlings as men, not a storm. Stannis would have the meeting and the fight and the name. He would send for his daughter when the night about the central gate breathed more kindly. "Who is the man?" Shireen asked Pylos, who made a study of names the way men who have lost the ability to fight make a study of swords. "A Snow," he said. "The bastard of Winterfell." Shireen liked the sound of it. She had made peace long ago with names that did not open doors in South Ron courts. Will he sing to the wall, do you think? She asked. Some men sing whether they want to or not, Pylos said. Because the song is the only thing they have left that's theirs. Shireen thought about that as she went to her lesson. The lamp behaved as if it had guessed a joke and would not tell unless asked kindly. Melisandre had decided to let the child decide when to light it. Silesi did not come to watch that evening. She had taken to kneeling in her chapel with her hands open on her knees, the way Shireen sat in Melisandre's chamber. And it surprised her to find that sitting thus did not invite temptation, but dismissed it with a nod in which mercy and pride both had their share. When Shireen sang that night, the flame did not need to be called. It reached to her like a dog loosening its chain because it recognizes its name in a child's voice. The ice did not crack. It throbbed, a deep, slow consent that carried through the stone into the men's quarters and the horse stalls and the kitchen, where a pot continued to simmer because the cook had fallen asleep on his stool. Davos, in his narrow bed, felt the sound pass through him like a wave that does not break. And he smiled without knowing he had until the morning when a man told him so, and he was embarrassed by the kindness of the report. In the night, when men who had never learned the habit of prayer found the sound their breath made comfort enough, something pressed at the other side of the world. The wall had been made to deny. It did not throw itself. It tested, the way a thief tests a latch after the house has gone to sleep. The pressure found a place where the ice had lately been asked a question and been allowed to keep its answer. It considered. It withdrew. It went away a little, and in that going the stars seemed, to one watchman, to swarm. He told himself he had been dizzy and held his peace. The next day brought men with faces not made at Eastwatch. They came out of the cold from the west with a look like men who have walked while being watched by 100 small, unkind eyes. They had a leader with a mouth like a rule. His cloak was furred where it had to be, and not where it wasn't needed. He looked at the red woman in a way that said he had no time for her, and then looked again as if some part of him had decided time was a luxury he could afford for a moment. He looked at the child the way a man looks at a small clear flame in a long winter, with gratitude and irritation. He looked at Davos and recognized in him a kind of obedience that has grown backbone and still chooses to kneel. He spoke the words he had brought: manse, fire and wood, snow that learns to spring when it has been pushed enough. He was not Jon. He was one of the men who kept the walls around Jon when he needed to be alive to keep standing between men and the night. Shireen listened and did not ask questions until she was alone in the bleak angle of the yard that had become her practice corner. When she sang that evening, the flame rose at once, a tall, attentive thing. She set it low, then lifted it, then set it low again, and in each motion the light changed not merely in height but in quality. She found a note that did not make the ice complain and held it. The wall replied at last in a language every man could hear if he would admit he could hear, a groan like a mountain sleeping, and a sigh like a giant making up his mind not to be cruel. Cotter stood at the top of the stair with his hands on the stone. "Well then," he said, the words drawn out of him like splinters. "We'll be having that, will we?" "We will," Melisandre said. "What happens when the song ends?" he asked roughly. Melisandre looked at the child who had lifted the note, and the lamp that had consented to be servant, and the wall that had consented to be audience. "It doesn't," she said. "Not if we leave room for the next breath." He grunted. "Breath I have," he said. "Not much else." "Sometimes that is all a world needs," she said. And for once she let the gentleness be heard under the certainty, because Cotter would not mistake gentleness for weakness. In the last hour before full dark, when the yard was a field of footsteps, learning to forget the men who made them, Davos found Shireen sitting on the lower step, with her hands tucked into her sleeves and her face turned up as if she were prepared to catch a snowflake. He sat beside her and let his knees complain, and then hush. "Tell me a thing that isn't true," he said, without thinking why he had said it. She did not laugh. "The wall is only ice," she said gravely. He smiled despite himself. "Tell me a thing that is true." She looked at him and did something she seldom did when she was not with a book. "You don't think you're brave," she said. "You think brave is doing something you weren't afraid of. But brave is when you are afraid, and you do it anyway, and you don't tell anyone because the telling would make it less brave. That's a story, I suppose. But stories can be true." "Some are," he said hoarsely. She reached and took his maimed hand in both of hers. Her fingers were small and hot from having been tucked away. She did not flinch at the scar. She pressed her cheek to his wrist for the smallest instant, a gesture so intimate it might have belonged only in the life of a family, by a hearth in a city where markets still bustle and men worry chiefly about rain. "Thank you for saying the words," she whispered. He could not answer. He nodded instead and kept looking at the sky until it became a place with no choices in it, only stars. The ravens came again, in numbers that made the rookery a storm of dark. News, not victory. Lions, not endings. A meeting set. A rider who had earned more scars than the watch had winter cloaks. A boy become a man because the world had not left him time to be otherwise. A name that would be written large and then crossed through and written low as men bent to the truth they had not wanted. Jon Snow. Shireen read the name on Pylos' narrow dispatch and tried it on her tongue. The name tasted like a promise kept begrudgingly. When she went to the wall that night, the flame took its shape without being asked. The note she had been living inside stretched and folded as easily as a cat changes its mind. The ice hummed back. Somewhere far along the line of the world, the wall makes. A pressure that had been exploring withdrew a little more. Not in defeat, but in the way a thoughtful enemy puts his head to one side and admits he will need a different key. Melisandre felt the change travel through the stone beneath the yard like a fox through snow under moon. She smiled, and this time, her smile was not a weapon. "Tomorrow," she told Shireen when the lamp was doused with a breath. "We will learn how to stop in the middle of a breath without losing it." Shireen nodded. "I like stopping," she said. "It makes the next part clearer." "It does," Melisandre said. "And if you stop too long, then the song belongs to memory instead of to you." Shireen said. And the Red Woman's laughter was a soft, genuine thing. Born without any plan at all. Dawn broke without breaking. The horse lines shook themselves awake. The Queen's men argued in low voices, and then remembered where they were, and put their arguments away, as if they were knives stuck through a belt in a crowded market. The cook made porridge that stuck to ribs and to bowls in equal measure. Cotter walked the top of the wall with a gait that had taught ice to respect it. Pylos warmed his hands over a brazier, and thought about sending a letter to the south that would not be believed by any man whose world had not taught him to listen to tunes no one sang. Celicia stood in the doorway of her chapel, with her hands on the lintel, and looked out at the yard, and the wall and the child her body had made, and time had remade. And a piece of ice dislodged from the edge of the chapel roof, and fell and broke at her feet, and the shards made a crown for a breath, and then melted. She did not take it for a sign. She had already taken more signs into herself than any woman can live with, and keep her skin. She smiled at the mess, and called for a boy to bring a broom. Davos went to his duties, which had been altered without being named. He supervised the unloading of sledges, and the ordering of stores, and the harnessing of beasts, and the small scut work that keeps men alive more reliably than speeches. He found he did each thing with a steadiness he had not owned in months, as if the oath he had taken in a place where old wood-bears' old faces had given his hands back to him. When he had a moment, he took it and went to stand by the wall, where the lower steps allow a man to gawk without anyone accusing him of gaping. He put his palm to the ice and hoped no one saw. The cold bit. He did not snatch his hand away. He remembered a boy in Flea Bottom, putting his cheek to a cistern on a summer day for the luxury of coolness, and he laughed at that boy and loved him for surviving. Shireen came to stand on his other side and did not interrupt his private conversation with the wall. After a time she said, "I think it can hear you even if you don't say anything." He nodded. "It hears the hours in a man. It knows when you've cheated and skipped some. I won't skip any." she said, as if she were promising herself a sweet and not a labor. "You will," he said. "You're human. But you'll know you did, and that's the part no wall can do for you." She tilted her head the way she did when a proverb leapt from the page and tried to bite her. "That makes me nervous," he confessed. "Good," he said. "It should." The day went about its work with the tireless indifference of days in cold places. Men mended, measured, swore, laughed too loud, then remembered and laughed quieter. The lamp waited where it had been set like a hound who has learned when it will be called, and when it will not, and chooses not to sulk. Melisandre sorted reasons by the promise in their sense, and put aside 3 slips of cedar that had come to her from a ship that never reached its port, because grief feeds flame in a way pride cannot. Selise scrubbed the altar cloth herself, rather than trust a girl whose hands she did not like looking. And in the scrubbing, she forgot to hate anyone. Toward evening, a wind came out of the west that had opinions. It made the ropes complain, and the horses lay back their ears. It made the sound of the wall cottony in the ear and coarse in the throat. Shireen lit the lamp, and then did not sing. She held her breath and let the wind have its say. When it had spoken and gone to sulk behind the blockhouses, she exhaled and made one note, and then another. And the lamp stood higher than it had before without seeming to try. The ice gave back a tone that was not a groan or a creak, but something like agreement. Somewhere very far along the line of ice, something stroked the opposite side, curious, and then withdrew again, not because it had been beaten, but because it had been obliged to respect courtesy. Melisandre permitted herself an extravagance, a touch to the child's hair that was not instruction and was not command. Shireen leaned into it for a heartbeat and then away, because 12 is an age made of leaning into and away from in equal measure. Davos, behind them both, let his breath out and watched it become visible and then disappear, and he thought, as he had been thinking since the night fort, that he had entered a long winter with a tool in his pocket he had not known he owned. Ravens do not wait for polite hours. In the deepest part of night, when even the wind had decided to be quiet, rather than lose all its strength to bickering with stones, wings struck the air above the yard, and a croak brought men from pallets as if a whip had gone down the lines. The message this one carried had no flourish. It was small and precise and unafraid of itself. One word at the top, "Come." A few at the bottom, "Castle Black." Between them, a name that had chosen to be responsibility when it could have chosen resentment, and thus had purchased a king's respect before any meal had been arranged. Snow. Melisandre read it. Selise read it. Davos read it. Shireen did not need to. She had known it would come. She turned to the wall and pressed her palm, and felt it chill her, and returned the chill with the heat of her hand, and stayed just long enough to be reminded who was larger. "We will go to meet the man with the name," she said. "We will," Melisandre said. "Your father will send for you," Selise said, meaning to forbid and finding herself invited to obey. "We will go because he says to. We will go because the song wants the next verse." Shireen said. And Selise did not rebuke the blasphemy because the word song had begun to work on her the way a child's laughter does on a very old dog. They made ready. They did not rush. The wall watched with its patient impassivity, which had nothing to do with indifference, and everything to do with a strength that had learned not to make a display of itself. The lamp went dark and did not sulk. Davos found a sledge runner, stubborn, and made it consent with a curse and a pat. Cotter came, scratched at the scar that had taught him to respect blizzards more than bishops, and said, "Tell your king to bring more nails if he means to make speeches at Castle Black. The planks there listen better when their boards are tight." "I'll tell him," Davos said. "Tell him also that when he meets the boy he'll be thinking to use, he should remember a tool works better if you oil it than if you dry it out with your pride." Cotter looked ashamed at having said so much, and pretended to spit, and missed the snow on purpose. "And tell the boy," he added grudgingly, "that the wall sings better lately, and we're not saying why." "I'll tell the boy," Davos said. and left off the last part because some gifts are sweeter when unnamed. Before they went, Shireen stood once more with her palms on the ice. She spoke under her breath. A private pact. Melisandre did not intrude on it with her god. Selisa did not intrude on it with her manners. Davos did not intrude on it with his fear. The child spoke to a wall older than any of them, and asked it to keep them honest. When they turned away, the lamp at her feet flared of its own accord, a thin spear of fire that bent and went out. The ice made no sound any man could have set to paper. The knight leaned closer, listened, and what it heard was not defiance but company. They set out when the dark had decided it could be left without sulking. Eastwatch saw them go with the relief of any garrison when anything moves somewhere else. Cotter lifted a hand, and then scratched his ear as if the hand had been engaged in that all along. Patchface waved with both arms and sang a line that made no sense and all sense at once. Under the sea the wall is a window, and the window is a wall. Pylus clutched his book in his armpit to keep the pages from stiffening, and promised himself to write down none of what he had seen, until it was all too late to matter to the men who would be offended. Selisa walked with her head up and her eyes forward, counting each step as if precision could barter with dread. Davos walked at Shireen's side and did not tell her to put up her hood. She knew when. Melisandre walked without leaving prints where she could help it, and where she could not, the snow seemed to find it did not care to remember her. The world narrowed to ice and rock, and the line of the wall at their right, speaking in a bass too low for most to hear. When they slept, it was in the lee of old stones that had learned their own uses. When they woke, the world remained and allowed them to continue. That is grace enough, Davos thought more than once, and wondered which god he had stolen the word from. On the day they came within the smell of Castle Black's kitchen smoke, the sky lifted its low lid and permitted a sliver of a moon to make itself known in daylight, like a shy lord making certain of the company before entering the hall. Men were already at work. Men are always already at work where duty has a hat to hang. The castle had the thrown-together look of poverty and purpose, forced into marriage. Shireen loved it at once, the way she loved cats who had taught themselves manners. Selisa sniffed and prepared to improve it by merely being present. Davos felt a strange homecoming, as if every place that accepts honest labor is a sort of port. Melisandre tasted the air and found it lively with recent courage. They were met by men who had learned to doubt as a way of preserving their lives. They were met by a boy who was not a boy, a steward grown into a shape the world had not planned for him, but had had to allow. He had eyes that had taught themselves not to beg, and a mouth that said yes to things no mouth should have to say yes to, if there were justice. The scar at his neck looked like an argument that had not been settled. He looked at Shireen and saw not a princess, not a vessel for a god's attention, but a child standing where men had been dying. He bowed the amount a bastard should bow to a king's daughter and no more. She curtsied the amount a king's daughter should to a man the wall had already accepted, and no more. And in that exchange Melisandre heard a new chord. One she had not planned, and she was honest enough to be pleased. "Princess," Jon Snow said, and his voice had winter in it, and something else besides, something like a hearth you only notice when you have been cold too long. "Welcome to Castle Black." "Thank you," Shireen said. "May I sing to your wall? I will ask permission and accept the answer." He blinked once, the way a man blinks when the world arrives a step ahead of his readiness, and then he nodded. He said. "Ask. We accept answers here. We have to." He looked over her head and met Melisandre's eyes. He did not flinch. He looked at Davos and let a corner of his mouth move. He looked at Selisa and arranged his face into courtesy. He looked beyond them toward the road where riders would soon return with news that would demand choices from him, that would cost him alone, and he squared his shoulders in the small, unconscious way of men who dislike theatrics and choose nonetheless to be brave. They went in. The wall looked down with its old level regard. The song that had been begun at Eastwatch shifted its weight in the air and found new companions in the timbers and the black rope and the old stones that had learned to hold up men as well as roofs. Shireen set her lamp down without lighting it. She put her palms to the ice and learned within the space of a breath that every place along the wall has its own character, its own favorite words. She altered the pitch of her voice by a hair. The flame rose in the lamp, though no match had been set. The ice made its small, consenting noise. Jon Snow, who had thought he had gone past surprise, was surprised and did not force his face to hide it. Melisandre did not look at him. She watched the child. She watched the way the wall listened. She watched the way the world, when you told it a true thing with patience, sometimes answered with something better than an omen, with a change you could keep.